So Vocal Chain is the headline new plugin in Cubase 13. In fact, really, it's the only new plugin because the other new plugins are parts of Vocal Chain, which have been then spun out into separate effects that you can use without loading up an entire vocal chain. As its name suggests, it's designed for vocal production. I think they actually say modern vocal processing in the release notes. And it's designed to be an all-in-one plugin where you've got everything you would need for vocal processing. If this is something that you haven't done before, this may be the solution you are looking for. It's certainly got some interesting features in there, which we'll be taking a look at. But if you've got your own solution and you've been doing this for a while anyway, much like a sort of washer-dryer situation, it may not do everything the way that you want it to do it. And you might end up wanting to use separate plugins or only use part of this. But it's worth taking a look at. So first things first, we're going to look at some of the presets because there's quite a few and they're quite varied. They've got some interesting features, as it were. So let's take a look at a few of those. So first, let's take a look at the background vocal preset.
I've been here and I've been everywhere.
As you'd imagine, it's EQ'd and compressed to make it fit as a background vocal. So it's fairly heavily compressed and been EQ'd to just narrow it up a bit. Not as much as some of the other presets that we'll see, but it's interesting to see quite a lot of use here. So the low cut has been taking a lot of the bottom off, and then the EQ is even working to cut curve here as well. So we can see what's happening here. Dynamic filters as well.
I've been here and I've
just working away on a bit of that. Now, obviously, a lot of these you would need to fine tune to the specific voice, etc., that you're using this with, particularly in terms of thresholds and frequencies, because this may not be the frequency that you want to get rid of, but they're often a good starting point. We can see it's making some use of pitch correction, etc. And there's quite a lot happening. So we're not going to go through every section of every plugin, but you can see there's a reasonable amount of settings which have been set for this and made this the sound that it is. And we'll get into some of these sections a bit later on in the video. So let's take a look at the next preset. So this is broken radio vocal. I think this is quite interesting because this shows how extreme you can go with this. There's really band limited and a fair bit of saturation happening in there with the distortion that's been set. But as you can hear, it's not just that saturation. The EQ really pushing that particular frequency, and the filters just cutting everything else out. So we've really got that very narrow thing, and that's instant access to that kind of broken radio sound, which is done in a quite smooth way. It's not super harsh, even though it's quite a harsh sound. So this is lower octave, please, and this is something which I've used a fair bit. Not this particular sound,
I've been here and I've
but this idea of having a pitch shifted lower vocal. So we can see this is down an octave.
Maybe sometimes
and is really adding some thickness. So if I bypass this,
but I never gave up, always got back on the go. I ain't stopping, gonna keep.
Now that's probably a bit strong for me. I'd probably bring the mix down on this a fair bit, or maybe have this doubled on another track and balance it up that way. But that adding an octave below a vocal to thicken things up, a bit like an octave pedal on a guitar, can work fairly well, depending on context, of course. So this is quarter delay throw, which is quite a nice effect. So this is something you probably have separately on a send and possibly bring it up after phrases, etc. So have a quick listen.
I've been here and I've been everywhere.
So nothing hugely exciting on its own, but this is the kind of thing that just adds in a bit of finesse to a mix, etc. So the kind of thing you just have subtly, and you probably wouldn't notice it on first listen, but it's the kind of thing you'd hear after 10, 20, in some cases a few years. You suddenly go, oh, I've never noticed that, etc. So it's that kind of bed of interest which can make production a little bit more interesting over the long term and add some depth and interest into a track. So again, nice to have access to this pretty much straight away, and really usable as it is, I think. So this is rock hot valve mic chain. So this, again, a particular style of music where you'd have this kind of thing. I'd probably have this.
I've been here and I've been everywhere. Had my worries and I've had my share of cares.
This is the kind of thing typically I would set up as a send and have just bring some of this in. So it's just adding some edge in there, because as it is, it's probably too much. But then there are other styles where this would work really well. So again, it's nice. And despite being distorted, again, it's quite a smooth sound to it because there's a lot happening here. It's not just a bit of EQ and a bit of compression. But now let's move on to the individual sections of vocal chain and take a brief look at each one of them. So first up, we've got gate, as you would expect. So this is nothing particularly exciting. It's just a gate which is going to cut in.
I've been everywhere. And I've had my share of cares.
So as ever with a gate, you've got threshold, but in this case we've got range here. So this makes it more of an expander because you can choose how much it's going to close. So a typical gate will close to infinity, i.e. nothing is getting through if you're below the threshold, but you can make it into an expander by changing the range. So here,
I've been here and I've been everywhere.
so while you can hear, I've deliberately set that so it sounds a bit weird, but by changing the range, you've made it so it's making a difference, but it's not cutting off quite as much. And we've got release, so you can make it close a little bit more gently. This is one of those areas where I think it would have been good to see the transfer characteristics, so a graph of input to output, and see that actually happening there. We don't have that, so that's something which is a little bit unsatisfactory as far as I'm concerned. And then we've got sidechain, so you can trigger this externally. So you can turn the sidechain on and then you can pick where you want to do it. But you've also got internal, so if you want to filter it, you can use this filter here on the track, the sound that you're actually putting through there as well. So it's nice to have a bit of flexibility in there. Next, we've got some fairly standard cut filters. So we've got some pretty steep slopes available here from 6 dB up to the steepest, which generally I don't think you find in most EQ. So often you'll find, in the channel strip in Cubase, you'll be able to change it, but I don't think 96 is in there. And frequency. Again, there's nothing particularly interesting about these. These are fairly workmanlike, but being able to save these all in one preset is useful because otherwise you'd need your channel settings as well as your effects. So it's nice to have it all in one. So pitch is the first area, which is potentially interesting, I guess, and creative, because here we can control the pitch.
I've been here and I've
so we've got this
everywhere.
Pitch correction. You can hear this actually working.
I've had my share of cares.
So changing the performance. You can get some interesting effects with that.
But I never gave up, always got back on the go.
Now this isn't going to work particularly well on this vocal in terms of pitch correction, but the detune is what's nice. Now we've already heard it in one of the presets, but being able to bring this down.
I've been here and I've been everywhere.
It's got a particular sound of its own. While obviously it's clear that it's been affected, I quite like the sound of that. Maybe you wouldn't want to use all of that, so you've got this mix control, and often for that, just adding some thickness.
Had my worries and
might want to add a few percent just to give a bit of bottom end that wouldn't originally have been in there, etc. And with scale source, we've got the normal kind of Steinberg options of MIDI scale, MIDI note, chords and scales as well. So if you've got your chord track set up, etc., the process can be automated in terms of pitch correction and so on. So we've got a De-Esser. This is a fairly straightforward workmanlike De-Esser. I think the theme is developing over this. None of these are particularly right home effects, but together, hopefully they'll give you something combined, which is more useful. Upper and lower frequencies for this. What's nice with the De-Esser is you've got the listen, so we can have a listen to what we're actually filtering. So the sh is lower down in this particular one. So we can hear that S for stop in there. So it's somewhere around here. And then we can reduce that. So being able to tune that is quite nice. And a De-Esser, certainly in my opinion, it's the kind of thing you can leave it off, but you nearly always get a much more polished result by adding one in. Even if it's only making a small difference, it's one of those cumulative things that a number of small differences seem to multiply together and improve things. And we've got 2 De-Essers, so if any of the following processing adds in some more S sounds, etc., or other frequencies, you can deal with that later on in the chain. So dynamic filtering. So this is effectively the EQ from frequency. So this is a dynamically controlled EQ. We've only got cut available to us. So let's move one of these out of the way and just turn the threshold. So it's not doing anything. So we're just going to concentrate on this one. We're going to move this up to here. And we can control the gain, i.e. how much it's going to eventually. And then the threshold in particular. So if the threshold is 0, the dynamic control never comes in. If the threshold is really low, then it will come in all the time. You can see that's coming in most of the time, the signal's present. So this allows you to fine tune it, along of course with the frequency, which I'd already done visually, and cue how narrow it is. So you can use this as a substitute for a De-Esser, and in some ways it's more flexible, but we've got the option to have both, which is quite useful. Next up, we've got Compressor 1. Now there's a choice of different kinds of compressor here. So Vox Comp, Transparent, Extreme, and Black Valve. We'll be looking at a couple of these in a separate video. But again, this is another area where I think maybe the transfer characteristic would have been nice to see. They're not super complicated compressors.
I've been here and I've been
and we get this, in this case, a percentage control and dry and wet control.
Maybe sometimes I have been feeling low, but I never gave up, always got.
So that's all wet. Now, if we change to transparent, we'll get different results.
I've been here and I've been everywhere. Had my worries and I've had my share of cares. I've been here.
So you can hear we get much more compression with that extreme compressor.
Had my worries and I've had my share of cares.
And finally, Black Valve, which we'll be looking at separately.
I've been here and I've been everywhere. Had my worries and I've had my share of cares.
So you can see we've got some different choices in terms of compression. And as with the others, we've got a side chain, so you can process your side chain signal or use any of the 8 available side chains to control this externally. So in the EQ section, we've got a choice of 3 different kinds of EQ. So the first one is the studio EQ, which will be familiar to many of you. It's like the standard Steinberg channel EQ or the studio EQ that you can have as a separate plugin. So we've got one band here, which is a low shelf. We've got 2 bands of parametric, and then we've got one band here, which is a high shelf. And that's pretty much it. So that's, again, perfectly workmanlike and the kind of thing you would have killed to have on every channel on an analog console back in the day if you were working in a small project studio. Now it's just fairly piecemeal. In addition, we've got 2 classic EQ simulations, emulations, where we've got the P1A, where we've got both boost and attenuation, which you can add, and we can see the overall curve, the effect it's having there. So even if you think you're doing the same thing with both controls, so if we set both those to 4.4, you think you're getting nothing, but overall we're actually getting a low shelf boost and then a little cut further up. And then we've got our band 3 here, which is much more standard, but again, the limited range simulating what's on the actual hardware, and then a bandwidth control, which you can see is working slightly different through a standard Steinberg EQ. May get time to look at whether or not we can null this. I'll look at that a bit later on, but nulling always takes a bit of time. And then finally, we've got our top-end attenuation with a frequency control. So a bit of an emulation of an analog classic EQ. And then in a similar vein, we've got the M5, which offers boost and frequency control for its first band, attenuation and frequency control for the mid band, and then finally boost and frequency control for the upper band. Now, if we look at this here, you may notice that this band now looks pretty symmetrical, but as soon as we start interacting with another one, we get this sort of asymmetric look. But yeah, these are, again, it's a simulation of another classic analog piece of hardware, and whether or not this will work for you is something you'll have to see. And of course, choosing the right EQ for the right situation is important, but in many cases, you can achieve similar results with a standard EQ, and hopefully we'll get time to take a look at whether or not these all null out with the standard EQ, and that this is just a convenient way of accessing those kind of settings. So the exciter, 2 controls, strangely placed at the bottom.
I've been everywhere. Had my worries and I've had my share of cares. Maybe sometimes.
We'll take a look at that, hopefully in a little more detail technically, but that seems to be adding in a bit of top-end excitement, adding some harmonics, etc. in there, but hopefully I'll get a chance to look at this in a little more detail. And then we've got the Saturator. So this is, for many, what you'd want to add to a vocal. We've got a choice of tape, tube, or distortion, which are probably fairly similar to the previously seen Steinberg channel strip plugins.
I've been here.
And you can hear that working there.
Everywhere.
So again, often just a bit of distortion is nice on a vocal, but it's something you can overdo. It's nice to have a mix control, because then we can just have a bit of quite severe distortion, or you can turn that down and have more of a less severe distortion, and they're definitely different. We've also got the ability to filter this, and we can hear that's the band that it's working in, because often you don't want to distort the low end and the top end. So this is a good way to get a smooth distortion sound without a lot of real high frequency fizz. Different algorithms. So tape. Let's turn this up.
I've been everywhere. Had my worries and I've had my share of cares. Maybe sometimes
you can hear that sounds pretty different.
Low, but I never gave up.
Distortion, definitely the most noticeable of the lot, and the one that's been some of the more extreme presets. A Compressor 2, EQ 2, Dyne Filter 2, and De-Esser 2. All repeats of what we've previously had, so it's useful to have these in the plugin chain. And I may not have mentioned, but you can actually move these around as well. So if you decide you want the De-Esser before there, or etc., you can do that. You can only move it within each section though, so you can't have 2 De-Essers here. Finally, the send effect. So we've got the imager.
I've been here and I've been everywhere. Had my worries and I've had my share of cares. Maybe sometimes I have been feeling low, but I never gave up, always got back on the go.
So with this, we're
I've been here,
just adding some time shift between left and right channels, as it says there. So let's listen to the difference turning this up and down makes.
Maybe sometimes I have been feeling low, but I never gave up, always got back on the go.
So that's the kind of thing, while that's working there, we're getting some sort of phasing and comb filtering happening with that. So I'm not sure I'd like the sound of that on this particular vocal, but there will be others where that does work.
I've been here and I've been everywhere. Had my worries and I've had my
performance shift between left and right channels is working much better for me.
I have been feeling low, but I never gave up, always got back on the go.
So really liking the imaging that that's giving. So in this particular case, this is the kind of thing I'd go for. And then we've got send level, so how much we're actually sending to that particular effect. The delay is reasonably straightforward.
I've been here and I've been everywhere.
So we can sync it to the project tempo, although that isn't the right tempo at this point, but we can.
Maybe sometimes
we're getting a visual representation of what's happening.
But I never gave up, always got back on the go.
And what's nice is we've got a ducker built in, so then you can have the direct vocal when the vocal's happening, but as soon as that drops out, it will bring up the level. So again, this is something that you can automate yourself. You can do it with a compressor using a sidechain off the vocal, etc. But it's nice to have all of this built in, and also having this filter. So again, you can have a lot of control of what's happening. So if you were to combine all of this, you'd be using quite a few channels if you didn't have access to this, because you'd need to filter it, then have a delay, etc. in there, use another compressor, etc. So there would be a lot to set up. It's totally achievable without using this plugin, but it's nice to have it all in one go. What's also nice on the routing of this is you've got the ability to send this to the reverb. So the delay output then goes to the reverb rather than directly out. So that's quite useful. And finally, we've got the reverb. Now, again, this is not going to replace anyone's FabFilter plugins, but it's nice to have this choice of different reverbs. Again, all available in here. My suspicion is this is probably the thing that's going to get used the least out of all of these, because most people have a reverb they like the sound of, and whether or not you like the sound of these will be up to you. But again, nice controls. We've got a graphic display showing what's actually happening with it. Pity we don't have that with some of the other dynamic effects. And again, usefully, as well as the reverb controls, we've got a ducker, release and send, and you can send it to the delay. Again, a useful thing and something that you'd be doing with routing if you're routing all these with your own channels. So the conclusion on this, well, while this is clearly not going to please everybody, I think this is a nice addition to have all of these things all in one. None of them are necessarily anything to write home about, but having 15 of these things all together, routed nicely, and also quite a few presets, which are good starting points and will hopefully provide some inspiration for you to create your own, etc. It's useful to have all this in and just be able to load up the one plugin where nearly everything is. And once you've got all those settings, you can save them and you're not having to play around with multiple channel presets, which is much more difficult to transport across projects and get a coherent, consistent sound among them. So that's the Vocal Chain plugin. As ever, hope you found that useful, and we'll see you again soon.